Something is happening right now that most people don't understand. And by the time the mainstream media catches up, it will already be too late to change what comes next. In the last 72 hours, 3 Chinese naval vessels have quietly departed the port of Zhoushan. They are not heading toward the South China Sea. They are not positioning around Taiwan. They are heading west. And their final destination, according to satellite imagery reviewed by multiple defense intelligence sources, is the Persian Gulf. Specifically, they are heading directly toward Bandar Abbas, Iran's largest and most strategically significant naval base. This is not a drill. This is not a routine naval exercise. This is China sending an unmistakable message to Washington, to Jerusalem, and to every capital in the Middle East that the rules of this region have permanently changed, and the clock is now ticking. To understand why this matters so deeply, you need to understand what the United States has had in the Persian Gulf for the last 30 years. Since 1995, the U.S. Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, has been the dominant military presence in this region. Every time Iran pushed toward conflict, every time Tehran threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, every time the Revolutionary Guard seized tankers, every time Iran launched proxy attacks through Yemen or Iraq, the presence of American aircraft carriers and guided missile destroyers served as the ultimate deterrent. The message was always the same. You can push, but you cannot push past this point. But what happens when China decides to plant itself alongside Iran? What happens when the world's second largest military, with the world's largest navy by number of hulls, physically positions itself between American power and Iranian territory? The balance of power doesn't just shift, it shatters completely. Here is what the intelligence community is genuinely frightened about right now. The 3 Chinese warships currently en route include a Type 055 destroyer, which is arguably the most capable surface combatant in the entire Chinese fleet. This vessel carries 112 vertical launch system cells, a weapons magazine that can hold a combination of long-range land attack cruise missiles, advanced anti-ship missiles, and layered surface-to-air defense systems. Alongside it sails a Type 054A frigate, a proven multi-role warship, and a Type 901 fast combat support ship, meaning this is not a brief visit, it is a sustained deployment. If this battle group takes up an operational position in the Persian Gulf, it fundamentally and permanently changes the threat calculus for every American naval asset in the region. The USS Harry S. Truman, currently operating in the eastern Mediterranean, cannot simply transit the Strait of Hormuz without accounting for a Chinese Type 055 sitting at anchor in Bandar Abbas. The strategic math has changed overnight, but here is what most analysts are critically missing. This is not about the ships. This is about what the ships represent. When China sends a naval battle group to operate alongside Iran in the Persian Gulf, it is broadcasting a signal that every regional actor, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Jordan, and most critically the United States, will be forced to interpret. That signal is this: the era of unchallenged American dominance in the Middle East is finished. You cannot pressure Iran without confronting China. You cannot impose sanctions without Beijing's cooperation. You cannot threaten military action without calculating Chinese retaliation. In one deployment, China has effectively extended its nuclear umbrella over Iran. And that changes every war plan, every contingency scenario, and every diplomatic calculation in the entire region. To understand how we got here, you need to go back 18 months. After Iran's nuclear program crossed what Israel's military and intelligence establishment considered an existential red line, the Israeli Air Force launched a series of devastating strikes against Iranian enrichment infrastructure. The Fordo facility was destroyed. The Natanz centrifuge halls were severely damaged. Iran's nuclear timeline was set back by what analysts estimated to be 3 to 5 years. Washington, while publicly maintaining distance, had quietly coordinated with Jerusalem and provided crucial intelligence support. Iran was strategically humiliated. Its most prized strategic asset, the nuclear program that was supposed to be the ultimate guarantee of regime survival, had been exposed as vulnerable. And in geopolitics, humiliation of that magnitude always demands a response. But Iran's supreme leader made a decision in those weeks that most Western analysts failed to fully appreciate. He chose not to respond immediately with missiles and drones, which would have invited devastating American retaliation. He chose instead to restructure Iran's entire strategic position at a fundamental level, and that restructuring led directly to what you are watching unfold today. Iran sent its most senior diplomatic and military delegation not to Moscow. Russia was already stretched thin across Ukraine and couldn't offer what Tehran needed, but to Beijing. And what Iran offered China in that negotiation was, by any measure, extraordinary. In exchange for military support, advanced weapons technology, and political cover at the United Nations Security Council, Iran placed on the table something that China had wanted for decades, but never been able to obtain: basing rights. The formal right for Chinese naval vessels to operate from Iranian ports in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. This was Iran's most precious strategic asset, and they offered it to China without hesitation. because they understood that this was the only card that could genuinely deter further Israeli and American military action. China accepted immediately. The deal was structured through a series of agreements wrapped in economic language: energy contracts, infrastructure investment, technology transfer, but the core of it was simple. China gets permanent naval access to the Persian Gulf. Iran gets Chinese protection. Think carefully about what this means for China's long-term strategic position. Beijing has been pursuing what strategists call the string of pearls for 2 decades. A network of ports, logistics hubs, and eventually military installations stretching from the South China Sea through the Indian Ocean and into the Middle East. Chinese-funded ports in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Djibouti, and Myanmar have given Beijing logistics infrastructure across the Indo-Pacific. But the Persian Gulf itself has always been the missing piece. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes every single day, has remained under effective American supervision since the end of the Cold War. With Iranian basing rights, that calculation is gone. Chinese naval power now has permanent treaty-backed access to the most strategically valuable waterway on the planet. For a country that imports roughly 70% of its oil from the Middle East and Gulf region, this is not merely a military victory, it is an energy security revolution. Now consider the additional dimension that makes this deployment so dangerous. Over the past 18 months, Chinese military advisors embedded with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps have been systematically upgrading Iran's anti-ship missile capabilities. The Noor missile, the Khalij Far's ballistic anti-ship system, the Zulfiqar. These weapons, already respected and feared by American naval planners, have been upgraded with Chinese inertial navigation technology, terminal guidance improvements, and enhanced resistance to electronic countermeasures. Independent defense analysts who have reviewed the technical specifications of these upgraded systems describe them as a generational improvement over what Iran possessed 2 years ago. What this means in practical terms is that the threat envelope for American surface ships operating anywhere in or near the Persian Gulf has expanded dramatically. A carrier strike group that previously had a meaningful buffer zone now faces threats from further away, from more directions, and with missiles that are significantly harder to intercept. The Iranian-Chinese partnership hasn't just added political complexity, it has added genuine lethality. Here's the specific window that makes the next 72 hours so critical. American policymakers face a problem with no clean solution. Option 1 is to surge additional naval forces into the Gulf to signal resolve and establish a visible American military presence that cannot be ignored. But this option carries enormous risk. Direct interaction between American and Chinese naval vessels in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf creates conditions where a miscalculation, an accident, or a moment of poor judgment by a junior commander could trigger a confrontation between nuclear-armed powers. Pentagon planners understand this. The National Security Council understands this. And they understand that Beijing understands this too, which is precisely why China chose a naval deployment rather than a less provocative form of support. Option 2 is intensive diplomacy, working through back channels to persuade China to moderate or reverse its deployment, potentially offering economic concessions or signaling flexibility on Taiwan that might give Beijing reason to reconsider. But this option has a devastating structural weakness. China has already received what it wanted. The basing rights agreement is signed. The energy contracts are in force. Chinese military technology is already inside Iran's weapons programs. What could Washington possibly offer that China would value more than permanent naval access to the Persian Gulf? The honest answer is almost nothing. China has played this round of the strategic competition extremely well, and the United States is now responding from a position of significant disadvantage. Option 3, the one that is beginning to be spoken about quietly in certain corners of the foreign policy establishment, is to accept that the strategic reality of the Middle East has changed permanently and to restructure American policy accordingly. This would mean accepting a reduced naval presence in the Gulf, pivoting even more aggressively toward the Pacific theater, and working to construct a new regional security architecture, possibly centered on a formalized Abraham Accords military alliance that doesn't depend on American naval dominance as its foundation. But this option carries its own catastrophic risks. America's closest regional partners, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, would almost certainly interpret such a reorientation as strategic abandonment. An abandonment of that kind has historically triggered precisely the kind of nuclear proliferation cascade that every successive American administration since Eisenhower has worked to prevent. If Riyadh concludes that the American security guarantee is no longer reliable, Saudi Arabia's long-discussed nuclear program moves from theoretical to imminent. If that happens, the non-proliferation architecture that has kept nuclear weapons out of the Middle East for 6 decades collapses. There is one final dimension of this story that deserves to be stated plainly, because it is the dimension that ties everything else together: the Strait of Hormuz. If Chinese naval forces establish a permanent presence in the Persian Gulf alongside Iran, and if tensions between the American-led coalition and the Chinese-Iranian partnership continue to escalate, the probability of a Hormuz closure, even a temporary partial closure designed to send a message rather than permanently disrupt trade, rises to levels that should concern every government, every central bank, and every business that depends on stable global energy markets. In 1973, a partial Arab oil embargo lasting 5 months caused a global recession and permanently altered the relationship between energy prices and economic stability. Today, with oil markets already tightened by years of underinvestment and ongoing geopolitical disruption, even a 10-day closure of the Strait of Hormuz would send crude oil prices past $200 per barrel. That price level would translate into gasoline and energy costs that would make every previous energy crisis of the last 50 years look manageable by comparison. It would mean inflation returning with a force that central banks, which have spent years engineering a fragile stability, would have almost no tools to combat. It would mean global supply chain disruptions, cascading across automotive, agriculture, pharmaceutical, and technology manufacturing sectors simultaneously. China understands this arithmetic precisely, and that understanding is the source of China's enormous leverage in the current moment. By positioning naval forces in the Persian Gulf, Beijing has effectively acquired a veto over the global economy. If Washington pushes too aggressively, if American forces attempt to challenge Chinese vessels, if sanctions are tightened to a breaking point, if military pressure on Iran escalates beyond what Beijing has decided to accept, China can signal or allow or simply fail to prevent a disruption to Gulf energy flows that would cause economic devastation across the Western world, at a scale no elected government in Europe or America could survive politically. China, with its massive strategic petroleum reserves, its long-term discounted energy contracts with Iran and Russia, and its more insulated domestic economic structure, would weather such a disruption far better than its adversaries. This is economic warfare conducted at a level of strategic sophistication that demands serious engagement from every policymaker with responsibilities touching on energy, defense, or international economics. So here is where we stand. Chinese warships are in the water and moving. The destination is confirmed. The timeline is 72 hours. The decisions made in Washington, in Jerusalem, and in Beijing over the next 3 days will not merely shape a regional crisis, they will set the terms of the global order for the next generation. Whether the political systems and individual leaders currently at the helm of these nations are equal to the demands of this specific moment is the question that history will answer and that the rest of us will have to live with. The margin for error is essentially zero. The consequences of miscalculation are essentially unlimited, and the clock is running.